Hey guys, welcome back to another World Championship prequel series between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. So this is going to be an ongoing series heading up to the World Championship finals in November. In this game, Caruana had the white pieces and Carlsen had the black pieces. And this game was played in the 2012 Grand Slam finals in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Caruana opens with e4. Magnus plays the French defense, d4, d5, knight to c3, and here bishop to b4, the Winawer variation from Carlsen. Caruana pushes forward, e5, we have c5 trying to undermine white's pawn base, a3, bishop takes c3, which doubles white's pawns, b takes c3, knight to e7, knight to f3, knight b to c6, bishop to d3, bishop to d7, here white castles, queen to c7, rook to e1, giving more support to the e5 pawn, and here Carlsen plays knight to a5. And this was probably a move order mistake by Carlsen. Knight to a5 has the idea of bishop to a4 and c4, and here black would have a lot of pressure against c2. Which is normally quite annoying for white in the French. But instead here c4 is, instead of knight to a5, c4 is actually one of the main moves, being after bishop to f1, then you play knight to a5, and then here white would play a4, preventing bishop to a4. But here knight to a5 from Carlsen. And well, you can see that this bishop is still on d3, so Caruana takes advantage of that with knight to g5. So here h7 is under fire, and moves like queen to f3, queen to h5 are coming. This white is starting to get an initiative in this position. Magnus plays knight to g6. So he's trying to meet queen to f3 with bishop to c6. This would open up a defense on f7. Caruana plays rook to e3, so preparing to swing this rook over to the king side. c4 from Magnus, bishop drops back. Knight to c6, so Carlsen is intending to plant this knight on f5, which would help to solidify his position on the king side. Bishop to h5 from Caruana, so preparing to bring the queen into the attack. Knight c to e7, queen to g4, and here bishop to a4 from Carlsen. Here Caruana should have taken the opportunity to play bishop takes g6, and if knight takes, then here rook to f3, and white has a double attack on f7. If rook to f8, simply capture the pawn on h7. If h takes g6, then here the idea for white is rook to h3. If rook captures, then queen captures. Well, white is threatening queen to h8, and well, black will find it quite difficult to defend the f7 point. If he castles, then simply knight takes f7, and this position is very good for white. But instead of this, we have rook to a2 from Caruana defending this point, and this allows Carlsen to solidify with knight to f5. The rook drops back because it's under fire, then simply castles from black. And usually in this kinds of structure, white will find it quite difficult to attack the black king, even though this b file is open. But because this bishop doesn't really have a good square to go to, this rook will find it very difficult to swing over to the queen side. We have knight to f3 from Caruana. The knight drops back because it wasn't doing much on g5. King to b8, here h4, so Caruana is trying to reroute this queen back into the game if possible. Rook d to f8, queen to h3, knight g to e7, queen to h2, so queen to h2 also, if black were to play f6, then white could capture and the queens would be traded off. And this would alleviate some pressure of white's position because black is going to start a pawn storm on the king side. h6 from Carlsen. Bishop drops back, so preparing to meet g4, g5 with h5. g5 from Magnus, h5, knight to g7. So Carlsen has managed to induce a little bit of a weakness on this pawn on h5. Knight comes to d2, so preparing maybe to reroute. Here f5 from Carlsen. Caruana plays en passant. We have queen takes h2, king takes h2, and rook takes f6. Caruana drops the bishop back, which defends f2. Magnus doubles on the f-file, knight to f1, knight e to f5, bishop to g4, bishop to e8, so this pawn is now attacked twice. Bishop takes f5, knight takes f5. And here, if you were to defend the pawn with g4, then black has knight to h4. So now black is threatening rook takes f2 and also knight to f3, which forks the king and the rook. So here we have knight to e3. Caruana gives up the h5 pawn. Knight takes h5, and king to g3. So we've reached an endgame where black is up a pawn with opposite colored bishops. But there are still 4 rooks on the board, and if black wants to keep winning chances alive, then he has to keep at least a pair of rooks on the board. And Magnus, being Magnus, tries to push for a win in this position. He plays bishop to g6, rook to b2, here h5, f3, and g4 from Magnus. So the idea is that if white takes, then Magnus will get his bishop to e4. Very nice centralized bishop, and moves like rook to g8 are coming. So here we have bishop to g5 from Caruana, rook to f5, f4. So Caruana is going to try and blockade this position with all his pawns on the dark squares. Rook to e2, king to c7, rook to b1, rook to f7. We have rook to h1, rook to h7, king to f2. Well, it seems that it's quite difficult to make progress at the moment because everything is covered by white. King to b6, g3, king to a5, king to e3, bishop to f5, king d2, rook to c8. We have a lot of shuffling of the pieces. Rook to b6, rook takes, king takes, so a pair of rooks has been traded off, and Carlsen does his best to keep the other pair of rooks on the board. So here, rook to d6, king to b2, rook to b6 check, king to c1, rook to a6. Carlsen doesn't want to trade rooks because that would eliminate winning chances. King to b2, bishop to e4, bishop to g5, king to d7, bishop h4, king to e8. So Carlsen is trying to bring his king into the game and somehow put this bishop on f3. King to a2, b6, king b2, king f7, rook to e1, b5, rook b1, king to g6, rook to e1, king f7, so a bit of dancing around before coming to f5. Rook to a1, rook b6, so Carlsen is preparing to break eventually with a5 and b4. Rook to b1, king to g6, king to c1, rook to a6, so Carlsen is inviting Caruana to capture on b5. And if rook takes, simply rook takes a3, followed by rook takes c3, and black has good pressure on c2. So here king b2, defending a3, king to f5. Black has managed to get his king all the way to f5, rook to e1, rook b6, rook b1, here a5, preparing b4, king to c1, bishop to g2, so Carlsen is ready to march his king into white's position. King to d2, king to e4, rook gives a check, king to f3, rook to e2, and here black has to be a bit careful because king to e1 and rook to f2 might be a threat, and this bishop would be won by white. b4 from Carlsen, so breaking on the queen side. A takes b4, a takes b4, rook to e3 check, king f2, rook to e2 check, king comes back to f3, and now Carlsen marches the king to h2. And we have c takes b4. Carlsen plays rook takes b4, rook takes e6 from Caruana, and here bishop to e4. So threatening rook b2 and rook takes c2. And here Caruana decides to give up the exchange, rook takes e4. And this complicates things a bit because now white has these passed pawns on e4 and on d4 and f4. But in fact, with accurate play, Carlsen should be winning this position. After f5, Carlsen should have played rook to b1. The idea is that this pawn can be stopped by putting your rook behind the passed pawn. And here if white tries king to e3 with the idea of taking on e4, which would support this pawn, you simply give a check. King d2, rook f1, looking at this pawn, so f6, king to g2, and here white is threatening king to black is threatening king to f3, followed by pushing his pawns because all these squares are covered by black pieces. And if here you allow that to happen, for example c3, and after king f3, f7, it looks like white is going to queen with check, but e3 comes with check, and after king c2, you play king e4, and this pawn is simply going to be lost. Black is also going to queen. So here, king to e3, stopping king to f3, but, well, black still wins after rook to e1, king d2, king to f1, very nice move. And, well, looks like white is going to queen again with check, but here comes rook to e2. And after king c3, rook comes behind the passed pawn. This pawn is going to fall, and black is going to promote. But instead of rook to b1 here, Carlsen played king to g2, probably trying to get closer to support this pawn. But that does allow white to play king to e3. And here again, rook to b1 would have allowed Carlsen to draw the game. After king takes e4, rook to c1, going after this pawn. d5, rook takes c2, so now black also has threats of his own with this passed c4 pawn. d6, you give a check, king d4, give another check, and here if king takes, then that would eliminate white's passed pawn. So here king to e5, simply push your pawn. After a move like bishop g5, attacking this rook, but more importantly controlling the queening square. You give a check, well, and then you can always come back to d2 because white can never capture this rook because black would queen first. So here, after giving check, king d5, give another check, and if white decides to hide on the c file with king c4, simply take the pawn, and here black would be winning. And if instead of king c4 you try king to c5, well, here black has rook to f2, which is also winning. After d7, rook takes f5, king c4, and then rook to f8. So black is just going to sacrifice his rook for the pawn, followed by trying to queen his pawns on the queen side. So something like this. And if here queen, this is going to be winning for black. This pawn is rolling down the board, and there's no way that black can stop it. Well, he could sacrifice his bishop for one of the pawns, but it is simply not enough. And this is just one of the possible variations. Here, after king to e3, Magnus plays a blunder, rook to b2. The problem with this move is that Carlsen is now going to find it difficult to get his rook behind this passed pawn because the king controls d2. We have d5 from Caruana, here rook takes c2, d6, and here Carlsen has to waste a move c3 in order to get his rook to d2. Caruana simply pushes forward, and now Carlsen has to sacrifice his rook for the pawn. And this is now simply losing for Carlsen. g3, f6, and well, all of these pawns can be stopped by white. c2 from Carlsen, king to d2, g3, e3, king takes c2, e2, bishop a5, so this covers the queen square. And in this position, Carlsen resigned the game because White is simply gonna queen first. Black can try king to f2, making room for the g-pawn, but unfortunately white queens first, and with check. So a win for Caruana. Magnus, being true to his style, tried to grind and push for a win, but unfortunately that blunder cost him the game. But kudos to Caruana for sticking true to the end. He put up a great fight, and also he complicated things when it mattered and managed to somehow swindle Carlsen. So I hope you enjoyed that game, and if you do, please subscribe for more future videos. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.